Chapter 1 is the commodity. Section 1, the two factors of the commodity, value and use value. Marx starts his analysis of capitalism by looking at the commodity. He spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out where to start in this process, and he almost settled on starting out with money, but ultimately realized that wouldn't work. So we're going to start by dealing with something that we all interact with, and we generally understand commodities. A commodity here is defined as something that satisfies some desire, whether it's food to eat, clothes to wear. Services are commodities. To be a commodity, something must be the result of human labor, and it must be something that is produced to be exchanged. So Marx talks about the three different kinds of values that a commodity has. The use value of a commodity is based on how useful a commodity is in fulfilling some desire or need. The use value of a commodity is independent of the labor required to produce it, and a use value is only realized when the commodity is used, when it's consumed. You could say that food has the use value of being eaten for sustenance, but that use value doesn't become realized until you actually eat the food. This is a very abstract kind of thing, so how it's measured isn't really important. We don't really concern ourselves with that. Exchange value is the value of the commodity in relation to other commodities. It changes with time and place. It appears accidental. It's purely relative. I could say that this phone is worth 3 loaves of bread or whatever. The exchange value is not intrinsic to the commodity. You can't look at an object and determine what the exchange value is. All commodities can be exchanged. In fact, as we defined it earlier, commodity is something that is produced for exchange. But you can't determine the exchange value of a commodity by looking at it in isolation. It's this relative relation. You express the idea of an exchange value in relation to something else. A keyboard is worth, I don't know, a candy bar or something, I don't know. A gallon of milk is worth 2 loaves of bread, 20 grapes for an apple. These ratios will fluctuate depending on the supply and demand. So with exchange value being defined as this relative worth of a commodity in relation to other commodities, it can't really be used to describe the value of a commodity as we might try to quantify it in some sort of absolute sense. Use values are qualitative, exchange values are quantitative. But there is a question, how do you evaluate the value of a commodity in general? And this is where the labor value comes in at. The labor value of a commodity represents the amount of labor that went into producing it. As we defined it earlier, all commodities are the product of human labor. You might represent that labor value in the number of hours it took to produce that commodity. For example, you might express the labor value of a chair in the number of hours it took a person to produce it. Commodities are the objectification of human labor. When a person does useful labor, they're putting their labor value into another object. If I make a chair, that chair is the personification of that human labor. In labor theories of value, it is this labor value that gives commodities their value. The longer you work on a commodity, the more valuable it is. But this doesn't mean that lazy or unskilled workers who take more time to produce a commodity naturally produce more valuable commodities. If you're in a supermarket shopping for shoes, and there's two different pairs of shoes there, one took twice as long to make but is identical to the other, the producer is not going to sell that pair of shoes for twice as much. Because if you're the consumer and you're seeing these two identical commodities, you're going to buy the cheaper one. So the market imposes this sort of socially necessary labor time. So Marx has this concept of a socially necessary labor time. If everybody took much longer to produce a given commodity, it would indeed cost more. The socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of the labor prevalent in that society. So the socially necessary labor time is the average time it takes to produce a commodity. So if you have one factory producing commodities at a much faster rate than another factory, the first factory is going to set the sale price of the commodities. So imagine you have two producers making the same commodity. If person A can produce them twice as fast as person B, well, person B has to compete with person A on the market. So person A can sell their commodities So person A can sell their commodities for less. Person B has to match that price or people aren't going to buy his commodities. So the value of a commodity depends on the average socially necessary labor time for that commodity. Introducing technology reduces the socially necessary labor time. Marx uses the example of the loom, which reduced the amount of time it required to produce textiles. By making labor more productive, the socially necessary labor time is reduced. Machines make production faster. And because they make production faster, the socially necessary labor time goes down, and the value of the commodity goes down. This is why, with technology increasing, commodities that we buy get cheaper over time. TVs used to be very expensive. Now you can get them a lot more cheaply. A thing can have a use value without having a value in the labor value sense. Air, dirt, untapped forests, these are items that cannot be really purchased, but they have a clear use value. This happens when a commodity is available that hasn't been produced through labor. Of course, technically it's not a commodity, but it's something you use. Someone who satisfies their own needs through their own labor creates use values, but not commodities, because, again, commodities are things that are produced for exchange. Someone who is producing commodities is necessarily producing use values for other people. This is transferred to them through exchange. Something having a value requires it to be useful to someone, otherwise it can't be sold, and it wouldn't have any value. And this use value can be something as trivial as being, it fulfills some nostalgic need. Imagine old Superman comics. They may not have a lot of use value in the sense that you can't do much with them, except maybe, I guess, keep a fire burning. But they fulfill the need of satisfying the person who's buying them. For a commodity to have value, it must be both useful and exchangeable. Its value is defined by the socially necessary labor time, although there is an element of supply and demand here, so Marx doesn't discount it. Marx is kind of looking at what's going on underneath the supply and demand relations and assumes supply and demand are in equilibrium in this analysis, just for the sake of illustrating the basics of this labor theory of value. Exchange value and use value represent what we would call a unity of opposites. Both are found in a commodity, but only one can manifest. If you exchange an object, you no longer use it, and you can't sell it and use it simultaneously. I can't sell you a loaf of bread and then eat it. So I can't have the exchange value and the use value of a commodity both manifest simultaneously. And that brings section 1 to an end.